It began with the rumble of engines that didn't belong. Seabrook Haven was a town of creaking docks, clattering gulls, and the hush of waves against hulls. Noise carried differently there, so when the black tide riders rolled in, heads turned, shoulders stiffened, and old Doyle whispered, "Nothing good rides in like that." But the person who felt it most wasn't a person at all. Argo, the shepherd at little Ava Hayes' side, rose from his resting place with uncanny precision. Ava didn't hear the roar. Her hearing loss softened the world, but she felt her dog move, body hardening into the posture of a soldier. She clutched his collar, trusting him without question. The riders came with their leader, Mason Crow, smooth words dripping with menace. "Accidents happen," he said, smiling at Ava as though she were leverage. "Boats catch fire. Nets get cut, unless someone makes sure they don't." It was meant as intimidation. But in the pause that followed, every eye shifted to the shepherd, whose teeth showed just enough to promise blood if the man came closer. That day, the riders learned that Seabrook Haven was not unguarded. It had Argo. Morning laid itself over Seabrook Haven like a soft grey blanket, the kind that comforted more than it warmed. Fog drifted low across the harbour, smudging the edges of boats and piling them into ghostly silhouettes. The water breathed in little hushes against the pilings. Gulls kept their thoughts to themselves. Ava Hayes knelt on the pier boards with the serious patience of a child who has already learned the value of doing a thing right the first time. The rope had a life of its own, heavy, salted, stubborn, and it took both hands to coax it into tidy circles. She worked close to the cleat where her father liked it, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth, the way it did whenever she needed all her concentration. On the shell-pink plastic of her hearing aid, 3 stickers marched in a crooked line, a starfish, a tiny lighthouse, and a gold dog paw that had started to peel at one corner from too many ocean mornings. Argo lay beside her, head on his paws, a kingdom's watchman pretending to nap. The scars on his right ear, 2 pale crescents, caught the thin light whenever he turned his head. Every few breaths, his ears repositioned, reading the harbour. A tug's distant cough, the creak of a fender, a door somewhere banging once, twice, then quiet. His eyes tracked the things that mattered, footfalls on the planks, a gull swooping low, the wind's sudden decision to change direction, then return to the small girl, as if she were the fixed star by which all else could be measured. Good circles, Daniel had told her, showing her once the way he always did. Then he had stepped aboard the Marigold and eased her out into the morning. That familiar silhouette, broad shoulders, sun-faded cap, jacket hanging open, shrinking against the fog. Ava had waved until he disappeared. She always watched until the last possible second, until the mist swallowed color and shape, and left only the place where he should be. Then she set to work with the rope. A routine becomes a kind of prayer when you do it every day with someone you love. "Almost," she murmured, more with her lips than her voice. The word barely shook the air. Argo's tail thumped twice against the boards. He didn't need volume to understand. Seabrook Haven woke slowly. The bait shop light flickered to life. Somewhere up the hill, Maggie threw open her diner's door and let the smell of coffee roll down toward the water. The harbour itself looked tired in that way old towns do when their children move inland and the great fish don't come like they used to. Paint peeled. Signs bleached. If you looked long enough, you could find a dozen stories of better years in every weathered plank. The little cottage where Ava and her father lived waited at the top of the slope behind her, blue paint stubbornly cheerful against the weather. A photograph of her mother, Grace, hung in their hallway. Hair in a wind-tossed knot, laughter caught mid-bloom. When storms clattered the windows, Daniel would stand in the hall and look at that picture like a man memorizing a map he might need again. There were nights when the house learned how carefully a man could breathe. The morning after those nights, Daniel was always quieter, his eyes gentler, as if he'd been walking a long way in the dark and had finally found the door again. Ava paused and touched the starfish sticker. It was a habit. She liked to make sure it hadn't fallen off, the way she liked to know Argo's fur was warm under her hand and that the rope would obey her. Certainties are hard won at 6, especially when the world once turned upside down and took your mother with it. The hearing aid's tiny processor clicked as it filtered the harbor's layered sound. Low frequencies often slipped by her. The world sometimes looked like a pantomime to be read off lips and eyes and hands. But she had learned to borrow Argo's ears. He had a way of telling her what she couldn't hear. A stiffness that moved down his spine. A lean in the direction of footsteps before they arrived. The way he pressed his shoulder into her knee when someone came up behind them too quickly. "Pretty good, Captain," a voice called, distant and kind. Old Doyle limped along the pier, thermos tucked against his ribs, cap too big for the head it sat on. His beard had gone to smoke years ago, but his hands still looked like they could talk a knot into behaving. He raised his chin at the coils. Ava smiled without letting go of the rope, and Argo's tail announced the greeting. Doyle crouched with a grunt that sounded like an old hull settling. "Your dad'll be proud of those. Make a sailor of you yet." He stretched a hand toward Argo's head, offering the back of his knuckles first. Respect. The dog accepted the benediction with solemn grace. Doyle gazed out into the fog, where the marigold had vanished. "Barometer's falling faster than the radio says. Feel it in the bones before the boys in Portland put numbers to it. Tell your dad to hug the line home if it turns sudden." Ava watched his lips and nodded. She had a careful nod, the kind that said she'd file it where important things go. Doyle's attention drifted to the dog again. "Saw dogs like him, long time ago. Not just smart. They made you want to be better men than you were." Ava, with a child's economy, extended a palm to Argo's chest. The dog exhaled slowly under her hand, a steadying rhythm. She didn't remember every lullaby her mother had sung, but she remembered this: how to find calm in someone else's breathing. When Doyle had gone, the pier settled back into itself. Ava finished the last loop, slid the coil into place, and sat back, pleased. She rubbed the frayed place on the rope with her thumb, the way Daniel had shown her, until the fibers flattened. "There," she whispered. "Good." Argo lifted his head and sniffed the harbor's story. He catalogued it: the tang of diesel, the sweet rot of seaweed, the faint iron of old chains. His eyes cut toward the harbor office where Leonard Pike stood behind glass, a figure in a box, phone pressed to his ear. Leonard had the look of a man who had been losing small arguments with himself for a long time. When he noticed the child on the pier looking back, he lifted his hand, quick and guilty, then turned away. Ava didn't wave. She had learned that not all attention needs answering. She dug into the pocket of her jacket and brought up 2 dog biscuits and a crumpled paper crane. The biscuits she parceled out with the measured fairness of a judge. The crane she set on her knee. Grace had been the one with patient hands, paper, ribbon, hair, the little domestic magics. Daniel had soldier's hands, gentle, out of practice. He tried, though. The crane had 3 creases wrong and still looked like a bird, ready to take flight. "I wish," Ava said very quietly, to no one in particular. She didn't wish for big things. 6-year-olds are practical. She wished for the fog to wait, for the boat to come back on time, for the sticker to stay put, for Argo to live forever. From the end of the pier, a swell found the pilings and thumped them softly. The water carried a hush that could be mistaken for peace. Argo's ears pricked, not high, like the crack of rigging, not near, like boots on wood, lower, farther, something gathering itself. The dog's head pivoted toward the road that wound down behind the bait shop. His body didn't move yet, but the stillness in him sharpened. A single deliberate breath like a lever thrown. Ava watched his face and understood. Maybe not the sound itself, but the shape of it inside him. She reached for his collar, fingers slipping under the leather the way a child slides her hand into her father's palm when the street gets busy. The collar was new enough that the stitching still felt crisp. It was hers, the way a house is a child's, by love and by right. "It's okay," she told him, though she had not decided whether it was. Argo flicked a glance at her. The look said, "I know." It also said, "Stay close." She set the paper crane on the cleat, where Daniel would see it when he tied off later. A marker, like a seashell left at the edge of a path to say, "We were here, and we were all right." A breeze licked at the fog and pulled it thin. Beyond the bait shop, the road woke with a soft, far rumble, the kind that slips through bone more than air. Ava felt it in the pier before she heard it, a faint shiver in the old wood. Argo stood, slow and tall, a door closing gently. Somewhere up the hill, a screen door slammed. A gull called and broke off mid-cry. Leonard Pike reappeared in the office window, and then wasn't there, as if he'd been yanked backward by an invisible hand. Ava lifted her chin the way Daniel did when he wanted to be brave for her. The starfish sticker caught the morning, as if it could hold the light. Argo edged a half step in front of her, not dramatic, not showy, just the geometry of protection. His shoulder aligned with her hip, his weight balanced, the angle of his body saying there is a line here, and you will not cross it. The rumble swelled into itself, gathering chrome and leather and intent. It came like weather the forecast hadn't respected. Ava's fingers tightened on the collar. Argo's breath touched her wrist. Steady, measured, a metronome for courage. On the far curve of the road, black shapes began to seep out of the thinning fog one by one, as if the morning had learned how to make trouble visible. Ava didn't look away. Argo didn't blink. Seabrook Haven held its breath. The sound came first, low, distant, a vibration more than a noise. It crept through the wooden bones of the dock, shivering up from Ava's knees into her chest. The gulls lifted off the pilings all at once, as if they had agreed that the air was no longer safe. Even the harbour itself seemed to draw back, its usual lap against the pilings, interrupted by a sudden hush. Ava didn't hear it the way others would. The hearing aid on her ear caught only scraps of the sound, turning it into a faint mechanical growl. But she didn't need sound when Argo was with her. The German shepherd stiffened so suddenly, it was as though an unseen switch had flipped inside him. One heartbeat, he was her lounging shadow, ears loose, breathing easy. The next, every line of his body sharpened into focus. Muscles bunched under his scarred coat, weight shifting ever so slightly forward, as though the pier had transformed into a battlefield, and he had already chosen his ground. Ava's small hand slid instinctively to his collar. She didn't look around to see what had changed. She looked at him. His ears, rigid as blades, pointed not to the sea, but to the narrow road that coiled down into the harbor. She felt the tautness in his frame, a vibration under his skin, and knew something was coming. Her father had once told her she could always trust Argo's warnings. "He's built to notice the things we miss," Daniel had said. "Listen to him, and you'll be safe." She whispered without voice, lips shaping the word. "What?" Argo didn't answer with a bark. He didn't need to. The tension in him was answered enough. The fog, still thick in the gullies and side streets, began to pulse with the approach of engines. Then the shapes appeared. 5 motorcycles emerging from the mist like armored beetles, chrome flashing in the pale light, exhaust growling in rhythm with each other as though rehearsed. The black-tide riders moved not like wanderers, but like men who had measured their entrance, timing each turn of the throttle to make the harbor itself flinch. Ava's fingers dug deeper into Argo's collar. She remembered her mother once saying that sometimes people carried storms with them, storms that no weather vane could predict. Even without the fullness of sound, she knew this storm had arrived on 2 wheels and black leather. They slowed near the bait shop, tires crunching gravel. The leader killed his engine first. The sudden silence of that act was sharper, more dangerous than the roar had been. He swung a leg off the bike with the slow ease of a man who never doubted his own claim to space. His boots hit the ground with heavy finality, Mason Crow. Ava didn't know the name yet, but she would not forget his presence. He had the kind of face that carried its own shadow, lined, weather-cut, but dangerous in its calm. His eyes swept the dock, landing on her like the weight of a hand pressing down. He smiled, but it wasn't kindness. It was calculation, measuring what value a 6-year-old girl and her dog might hold in a place like this. The other riders followed his lead, engines falling silent one by one until the harbor lay in a kind of dead stillness. Only the tick of cooling engines and the faint flap of a flag against its pole broke the quiet. Ava thought the silence sounded wrong, as if the whole town had been tricked into holding its breath. Argo stepped forward, blocking the line between her and the strangers. His hackles lifted not wildly, but with the precision of a soldier unfurling a flag. He didn't growl, he didn't need to. The quiet authority in his stance spoke clearly. This ground, this girl, are not yours. Mason's smile tilted as he noticed the dog's transformation. Well, well, he drawled, his voice carrying across the dock like gravel poured slow. A guard already standing watch. Didn't know Haven still had teeth. He glanced over his shoulder at his men, who spread loosely, as though by instinct, fanning out in a pattern that felt too practiced to be random. They weren't here for sightseeing. They were here for something more. Ava pressed her cheek briefly against Argo's fur. It smelled like salt and smoke, familiar, safe. He was steady under her hand, but his body thrummed with energy, ready to spring. Through him, she felt the warning in her bones. Even without hearing the exact words, she understood the truth. These men were danger. Leonard Pike appeared in the harbor office window, framed by glass that reflected the pale sky. He didn't open the door or step outside. He only watched. His hand remained near his phone, but he didn't move to call anyone. His face was a puzzle Ava couldn't read, but Argo's lip curled faintly when he saw the man, and that was enough to twist her stomach. Mason took a step closer, boots loud against the boards. The sound was deep enough that even Ava's hearing aid caught it, a hollow thud like a drumbeat echoing in her chest. His eyes flicked to the rope coils beside her feet, the neat circles she had worked so carefully, and then back to her face. Helping out early, huh? Harbor's a rough place for little ones. He bent slightly, not crouching, just lowering his gaze to her level, in a way that felt more like a predator, measuring prey than an adult greeting a child. Argo moved in sync with him, the motion precise and fluid, sliding between Ava and that gaze, teeth showing now in a controlled display. His head stayed low, his eyes locked, The message was simple. Another step, and there will be consequences. Mason paused. For a heartbeat, Ava thought she saw something flicker across his face. Not fear, not exactly, but recognition. He knew this stance, this kind of dog. He straightened slowly, palms half raised as if to acknowledge the challenge without conceding it. "Well," he said softly, almost to himself, "you're not just somebody's pet, are you?" Ava didn't move. She felt her chest rising and falling too quickly, but she kept her hand on Argo's collar, anchoring herself to him. Through the trembling in her fingers, she sensed his steadiness. It was as if his calm bled into her, telling her she could be strong as long as he was between her and the danger. Behind Mason, one of the bikers muttered something. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw his eyes flick to her hearing aid, then to the scar on Argo's ear. The man's mouth curled in disdain, but Mason cut him a look sharp enough to silence him. The group adjusted, tension in their shoulders easing into something more casual. But Ava could tell it was an act. Their eyes kept darting back, watching the dog, measuring the child, calculating. The fog shifted, carrying the faint tang of diesel and rain. Somewhere far offshore, thunder muttered its own warning, low and uncertain. The storm on the horizon was still a day away, but it had already chosen its side. Ava clutched Argo's collar tighter. Her lips shaped another whisper, one he seemed to understand without hearing. "Don't let go." He didn't. His body stayed firm, a wall that breathed and waited, every muscle ready. His silence said what Ava could not. The riders might have come into Seabrook Haven like they owned it. But to take one more step toward this child, they would first have to pass through him. The air held steady, heavy, as though even the gulls were waiting to see who would make the first move. The rumble of the motorcycles had settled into a tense quiet by the time the Marigold came slicing back through the fog. Daniel Hayes stood tall at her wheel, his weathered face set in lines Ava knew too well, the look of a man who had measured danger before and understood its shape. He hadn't planned to cut the trip short, but when the gulls scattered like gunfire and the fog carried the unnatural echo of engines, something in his chest tightened. Instinct. The same instinct that had carried him through battlefields where silence could be as lethal as a bullet. Through his binoculars, he saw them. 5 men in black leather, clustered too close to the pier where his daughter knelt. And in front of her, Argo, rigid, ears pinned, teeth half bared. Daniel's gut clenched. He throttled the boat harder than was wise for the shallow slip, throwing a spray against the jetty. The wake slapped the pilings with a sharp, angry rhythm. By the time he tied off and strode down the dock, his boots landing heavy against the boards, his face betrayed nothing but calm. But inside, his blood had already quickened into readiness. "Ava," he called, voice steady, almost casual. "Everything all right here?" His daughter turned, relief softening her shoulders. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Argo's stance, taut and coiled, had already told him the truth. Mason Crow was the first to step forward. He removed his mirrored sunglasses with deliberate slowness, revealing eyes like cold river stones. "You must be Hayes," he said, voice smooth as oil on water. He extended a gloved hand, as though the gesture itself could rewrite the last tense minutes. "Mason Crow. My associates and I are exploring business opportunities in Seabrook Haven." Daniel didn't take the hand. His gaze dropped once to the leather patch on Mason's cut, the coiled serpent insignia of the Black Tide Riders, and then lifted again to the man's face. "What kind of business brings motorcycles into a fishing harbor?" His voice was calm, stripped of decoration. Years as a Navy medic had taught him that plain words cut the cleanest. Mason let the refusal of the handshake linger in the air like smoke before withdrawing his hand. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Protection services," he said. The two words carried a weight more threatening than any shouted demand. Small towns like this, accidents happen. Boats catch fire. Gear goes missing. With a little cooperation, we make sure those unfortunate events never trouble a man's livelihood. Daniel felt Ava's hand clutch at his pant leg, small fingers trembling, but determined. He shifted just enough to shield her with his body, his stance casual but deliberate. Beside her, Argo eased into position, a silent extension of the man's intent. "We already have protection in Seabrook Haven," Daniel said evenly. His eyes flicked toward the harbor office, where Leonard Pike lingered behind the glass. The harbor master's jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on the floor rather than the scene outside. That avoidance said more than any words could. Mason noticed the glance, and a smirk tugged at his mouth. "Police? Harbor master?" His voice dipped, amused. "Let's be honest. Men like that only step in after it's too late." He gestured vaguely toward Ava. "Wouldn't want anything to happen while they're looking the other way." The implication burned in Daniel's chest, but his expression remained impassive. He had learned long ago not to give men like this the satisfaction of visible anger. Instead, he let silence stretch, heavy and deliberate. In the quiet, the sea seemed to breathe louder, waves slapping against the pilings, with a rhythm that matched his tightening pulse. One of the riders shifted his weight and muttered something under his breath. Daniel didn't catch the words, but Argo's ears twitched sharply, his lips peeling back to flash white teeth. The man stilled immediately, reminded that some boundaries had already been drawn. "You've said your piece," Daniel finally replied. "Now you'll want to leave." Mason's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. He stepped closer, boots echoing on the dock, until he was close enough for Daniel to smell the faint tang of leather and gasoline. "We'll be back," he said softly. "Think about what matters most to you, Hayes. This harbor, your boat, your little girl. Protection is cheaper than repair." The words hung in the air, heavier than the approaching storm clouds. Behind them, Leonard Pike shifted again in his office window. For a moment, his eyes lifted and met Daniel's across the glass. Then, just as quickly, he looked away. Daniel's jaw tightened. Something was off. The riders mounted their bikes with the practiced grace of men too comfortable with intimidation. Engines flared back to life, snarling against the fragile quiet. As they pulled away, Mason turned once more, eyes catching the horizon where dark clouds had begun to bruise the sky. "Storm's coming," he called over the roar. "Best to be ready." The thunder of their departure rattled the pilings until they disappeared up the road. Daniel exhaled slowly, crouching to meet Ava's eyes. "You did right," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair back from her cheek. Her hearing aid caught the faint glint of grey light, stickers still clinging stubbornly. Argo pressed close, his steady presence anchoring them both. Daniel glanced once more toward the harbor office. Leonard Pike was gone from the window. The silence left behind felt heavier than the engines had. Out over the water, the horizon thickened with storm clouds, purple-black and seething. The sea knew what was coming. Daniel did too. This wasn't just weather. This was the shape of something larger, something that would test not only him, but every soul in Seabrook Haven. The wind picked up, tugging at the loose ends of rope on the dock. Ava's small fingers slipped back into Argo's collar. Daniel straightened, his eyes fixed on the darkening sky. The storm was no longer distant. It was already here. Seabrook Haven lived by the rhythm of the sea. Its mornings carried the hush of tides pulling back from stone steps, and its evenings closed with gulls returning to their nests along the cliffs. But it was the nights, when lanterns and candles flickered across the harbor, that the town's soul revealed itself most clearly. Every spring, when the air softened and the storms relented, the people of Seabrook Haven gathered for the candle ceremony. It was a tradition older than any fishing boat still floating, older even than the battered chapel that leaned against the wind at the end of Main Street. They said it began after the first whaling vessel went down in a storm, more than a century ago, when widows and children needed some way to tell the sea they had not forgotten. That evening, the harbor glowed with hundreds of small lights, candles set inside paper boats, lowered one by one onto the dark water. The tide carried them outward, drifting like a constellation across the surface. Names were spoken aloud, one after another, voices breaking but steady, until the night itself seemed to remember. Ava stood between her father and old Doyle, her small hands clutching the paper boat Daniel had helped her fold. It was clumsy compared to the delicate origami her mother once made, but Ava had covered its sides with stickers, a lighthouse, a blue star, another golden paw print. She ran her thumb over the stickers as if sealing them against the damp air. The hearing aid tucked behind her ear glinted when the candlelight caught it. Tonight, she had added a seashell sticker to it, careful and crooked, like a promise to keep something of the sea close to her. She didn't hear all the names spoken. The hearing aid captured fragments, broken syllables, and the hush of wind between. But she watched the faces, the way lips shaped grief, the way shoulders stiffened when a name carried more weight than memory could hold. Daniel's hand rested lightly on her shoulder. He had said Grace's name only once tonight, quietly, almost into the collar of his coat. Grace Hayes, lost 2 years ago in a sudden squall that had rolled in faster than forecasts could warn. Her small boat had been less fortunate than the others that day. By the time Daniel reached the coordinates, there had been nothing but debris and silence. He still carried that silence. Ava felt it in him every day, even when he smiled at her or brushed her hair back before school. It lived in the lines at the corners of his eyes, in the way he sometimes stood too long in front of her mother's photograph, as if expecting the image to breathe. When Grace's name was spoken tonight, Daniel had drawn a breath so sharp Ava had noticed, even over the crackle of her hearing aid. He hadn't let it out for a long moment, as though keeping the sound inside would keep the memory closer. Then he had squeezed her shoulder once, and she had nodded in return, the two of them tethered by an unspoken promise. We will not let her vanish. Argo sat on Ava's other side, his posture almost ceremonial. The candlelight flickered against his scarred ear, highlighting the uneven ridges that marked another life, a soldier's life, before he came to theirs. Some townsfolk still saw him as just a dog, but Ava knew better. Tonight, with the paper boats floating like souls across the harbor, she felt the weight of his presence differently. He was both anchor and witness, as much a guardian of memory as he was of her safety. Old Doyle cleared his throat when his turn came. His voice cracked, years and salt water roughening the edges. He spoke the names of shipmates long gone, men whose laughter he claimed he could still hear when the tide was just right. When he finished, he wiped a sleeve across his face, muttering something about the smoke from the candles, though there was no smoke. Ava slipped her hand into his, small and certain, and Doyle gave it a gentle squeeze, surprised by the child's quiet strength. As the tide carried the boats farther out, the town fell into silence. The sea reflected back a river of stars, each flickering flame carrying both sorrow and hope. The breeze picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain, and far out on the horizon, a bank of dark clouds shifted against the last light. The storm Mason Crow had hinted at was coming, and the sea seemed to know it too. Daniel stood straighter, watching the line where water met sky. He had always measured his life against the horizon. Deployments overseas, rescues gone wrong, storms that could turn a calm morning into a nightmare. Now that horizon seemed less like a boundary and more like a warning. Ava tugged gently at his sleeve, pointing to her boat as it floated beyond the docklights. Its little candle bobbed stubbornly between larger vessels, stickers gleaming faintly in the dark. She wanted him to see that her mother's memory was out there too, carried by the water, safe for another year. She'd like that, Daniel said softly, not needing to explain who. Ava nodded, her throat tight. She leaned into Argo, pressing her cheek against the warm fur at his neck. The shepherd exhaled slow, steady, and she matched her breath to his until the ache in her chest loosened. The last names were spoken. The boats drifted beyond sight. Families began to gather themselves, voices hushed, steps heavy on the planks. The town would return to its routines tomorrow, nets to mend, shops to open. But tonight it had stopped to remember, to bind itself tighter against loss. Daniel lingered longer than most, his eyes fixed on the black edge of the horizon. The storm out there mirrored the one he felt inside. The riders, the threats, the harbor master's averted gaze. He knew storms well enough to recognize when one was about to break. This time, though, it wasn't just his own life in the balance. It was Ava's, and the fragile piece of Seabrook Haven that still dared to hope. When he finally turned away, Ava slipped her small hand into his. The stickers on her hearing aid caught the glow of the last lantern as they walked back up the pier, Argo pacing close beside them. Behind them, the sea held its constellation of candles until the tide carried them out to where memory and darkness met. And above it all, the storm clouds gathered, heavy and inevitable. The bell above Maggie's diner door gave its tired jingle as Daniel pushed it open, letting Ava slip in ahead of him. Argo padded close at her side, nails tapping softly against the worn tile floor. The smell inside was the same as it had been for decades. Strong coffee, fried bacon, and the faint sweetness of Maggie's pies cooling on the sill. It was comfort stitched into scent, the kind that made even men hardened by storms feel they had a place to sit down and breathe. Morning light filtered through lace curtains, catching on the chipped enamel mugs lined along the counter. Old Doyle sat in his usual spot near the window, a thermos at his elbow, his cap pushed back just enough to reveal the deep grooves cut into his forehead. A couple of other fishermen leaned across the table with him. Ben Turner, shoulders broad as his trawler, and Sam Kelly, whose hands were always stained with net tar. Their voices had the low rumble of men who had seen better years, each word carrying the weariness of too many seasons fighting a losing tide. Boats ain't bringing in half of what they used to, Ben was saying as Daniel and Ava slipped into a booth nearby. Used to be you'd fill a hold before noon. Now you're lucky if you've got enough to pay for the fuel by sunset. Sam shook his head, staring into his black coffee. Ain't just the fish stocks. Outsiders have been circling this town like gulls on a gut pile. Developers, so-called investors. Now these riders are sniffing around too. It doesn't feel right. Doyle lifted his gaze toward Daniel, acknowledging his presence with a slow nod. His eyes were pale, watery now with age, but there was a sharpness in them that hadn't dulled. Speak of the devil, he muttered. Hayes, you had company down at the docks yesterday. Daniel slid into the booth across from him. Ava pressed close to Argo, who sat tall against the bench, scanning the room with quiet alertness. The old dog's scarred ear twitched at every clink of cutlery, every shift of a chair. They came looking for trouble, Daniel said evenly. He didn't have to name Mason Crow. Every man in the diner already knew. Called it protection, said accidents happen. Ben cursed under his breath. Sam's fist tightened around his mug. But it was Doyle who spoke with the weight of someone who had seen shadows like this before. He leaned forward, voice gravelly but steady. They won't stop, Hayes. Men like that don't just pass through. They plant their boots and start rotting the ground under 'em. I saw it in Nam. It didn't matter how small the village was. Somebody always came to take a piece. Sometimes it was the army. Sometimes it was men in leather who thought war made them kings. The families paid. Daniel's jaw worked, but he kept his tone calm. You think they'll come back? Doyle's laugh was short, humorless. Boy, they've already decided this place is theirs. Yesterday was just them sniffing the air. Next time, they'll come to bite. Silence stretched at the table. Only the clatter of plates and Maggie's low humming from behind the counter filled the room. Ava fidgeted with the stickers on her hearing aid, her small fingers tracing the lighthouse decal. She caught pieces of the conversation, enough to know these men weren't talking about storms of weather. She pressed closer to Argo, who responded with a soft huff, as if reassuring her that whatever these men feared, he was ready for it. Doyle's eyes drifted to the shepherd, softening for a moment. He reached out, slow enough that Argo didn't bristle, and patted the dog's shoulder. You've got yourself a fine animal there, Hayes. Reminds me of the war dogs we had overseas. Smartest creatures I ever saw. Knew when to sit quiet, when to stand their ground. Saved more boys than I can count. Argo sat steady under the touch, gaze still sweeping the diner. Doyle smiled faintly, the lines around his mouth deepening. They carried scars, too, just like this one. His fingers brushed the uneven ridge along Argo's ear, but they never forgot their duty. Not once. Daniel's eyes dropped to the dog, and for a moment he saw not just his daughter's guardian, but the echo of his cousin Sarah, who had trusted this same shepherd with her life in another war. The weight of that history pressed heavy on his chest. They'll test him, Doyle warned, drawing Daniel's focus back. They'll test you. Might start small. A smashed window, a rope cut on a dock. Then they'll push harder. They'll see if fear breaks you before fists do. Ben grunted. And what if it does? Folks are tired, Doyle. You think they've got fight left in them? You think Maggie there, or Sandra Kelly, or the old Johnson sisters can stand up to a pack of men with guns and nothing to lose? The old fisherman's gaze didn't waver. Fight's not about strength, Ben. It's about what you're willing to lose before you bend. These riders think we're soft. That's their mistake. Daniel leaned back, letting the words settle. He could feel Ava's eyes on him, waiting for some sign that the world wasn't as fragile as it suddenly seemed. He reached over and squeezed her hand, steady and warm. They're not the first wolves I've seen circle a village, Daniel said finally, voice low but carrying. And wolves can be driven off. You just have to make them believe the cost is too high. Doyle's expression softened, pride flickering behind his weathered face. Spoken like a man who's seen the dark and come back standing. Don't forget that, Hayes. You've got more than just nets and rope here. You've got a daughter who's watching every move, and a dog who'd walk through hell for her. Ava ducked her head, cheeks warm, though she didn't fully understand why the men spoke of her with such weight. She only knew that Argo pressed against her leg like a shield, and that when her father's hand covered hers, The world felt less uncertain. The conversation drifted into silence again, the kind that wasn't empty, but full of unspoken understanding. Outside, the gulls wheeled low over the tide. Through the diner window, Daniel caught a glimpse of Leonard Pike walking briskly across the harbor office, a phone pressed to his ear, his face shadowed. The harbor master's posture was tight, like a man carrying more than he could balance. Daniel's gut stirred uneasily. Doyle noticed the glance. "Watch him," the old fisherman murmured. "Sometimes the enemy's not the one roaring at your gate. Sometimes it's the one already inside." The words settled heavy in Daniel's chest as Maggie set down a plate of eggs in front of Ava, her gentle smile hiding the worry she carried too. The child picked at her food, her hearing aid buzzing faintly, her eyes flicking from her father to the window where Leonard Pike disappeared from view. Storm clouds loomed heavier out past the horizon. The town's traditions and prayers might bind them for now, but Daniel knew what Doyle meant. Storms weren't only weather. Some storms walked on two legs, carrying shadows in their wake. And Seabrook Haven was about to be tested. The wind shifted that afternoon, rolling in from the Atlantic with a dampness that clung to skin and rope alike. Seabrook Haven's harbor, usually a place of noisy labor, seemed oddly subdued. Nets lay stretched but half-mended across wooden racks. Gulls circled lazily, their cries sharper, restless. Even the water slapped against pilings with a rhythm that felt less like the sea's heartbeat and more like a warning. Ava trailed a few steps behind her father as they walked along the pier. She carried a battered sketchbook under her arm, its corners bent from too many days in salty air. Sometimes she drew boats, sometimes dogs, sometimes just shapes that reminded her of sound. She didn't always hear what others did. The sharp calls of fishermen across the dock, the rattle of chains dropped too quickly. But she had learned to see the world differently. And she saw things her father missed. She saw Leonard Pike. The harbor master stood half-hidden behind the frame of his office window, phone pressed to his ear. His lips moved quickly, his free hand gesturing as though trying to argue with someone unseen. Ava tilted her head, narrowing her eyes. She couldn't hear the words, not clearly, but she caught the tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze darted toward the docks where her father worked. Argo caught it too. The shepherd slowed, muscles tightening beneath his weathered coat. His ears pricked forward, his scarred one twitching as if remembering old orders. He let out a low sound, half growl, half breath, that vibrated against Ava's hand when she rested it on his back. "Easy, boy," she whispered, though the steadiness of her own voice surprised her. She looked up at the office again. Leonard's hand now covered part of the glass, like he didn't want anyone reading his lips. That alone set a knot twisting in her stomach. "Daddy?" She tugged at Daniel's sleeve. "He's on the phone again. The harbor man. He looks sneaky." Daniel paused, following her pointing finger. Through the reflection of sun on glass, he caught only fragments. Leonard's hunched posture, his hand gripping the phone tight enough to whiten his knuckles. Daniel frowned, but the worry on his daughter's face pressed at him more than the scene itself. "Sometimes grown-ups look serious when they talk business," he said gently. "Doesn't mean they're sneaky." "But Argo doesn't like him," Ava pressed. She leaned into the dog's side, feeling the steady tremor of readiness in him. "See?" Daniel glanced down. Argo was no longer relaxed. His stance was military sharp, weight balanced evenly as if awaiting command. The shepherd's amber eyes didn't waver from the office door. For a moment, Daniel felt his own chest tighten. He had seen this same posture once before in Helmand Province, outside a medical tent, when Sarah's dog had frozen, body taut, before anyone else sensed the IED buried just yards away. That memory had never left him. But this was different, wasn't it? A small town, not a battlefield, a harbor master with debts and a sour attitude, not an insurgent with explosives. Daniel straightened, exhaling through his nose. He's just a man who's made some mistakes, sweetheart. Don't worry about him. That's grown-up trouble, not yours. Ava's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't argue further, but she didn't let go of Argo's collar either. The shepherd remained tense, eyes tracking Leonard Pike as he finally lowered the phone. The harbor master stepped outside, blinking against the sun, his gaze sweeping the docks before landing briefly on Daniel. For the smallest second, something unreadable flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or fear. Then he masked it with a forced half-smile and a wave that didn't reach his eyes. "Hayes?" Leonard called, voice pitched too cheerfully. "Storm rolling in quicker than the reports say. Best tie your girl's sketches down before the wind carries them off." Daniel raised a hand in return, his own expression neutral. "We'll manage." Leonard nodded and turned away, heading toward the far end of the pier. His steps were quick, his shoulders hunched, as if the weight of something unseen pressed down on him. Ava leaned against her father's side, whispering up through the hum of her hearing aid. "He's hiding something." Daniel placed a hand on her hair, smoothing it gently. "Even if he is, it's not ours to fix tonight. Come on, let's get home before the rain finds us." But as they walked, Daniel's mind replayed the small details he had tried to brush aside. The harbor master's eyes, avoiding his yesterday when Mason Crow stood on the dock. The hurried phone calls, the nervous way Leonard's hands shook when anyone mentioned the riders. He told himself it could be desperation, just a man drowning in debt. Still, the feeling gnawed at him. Argo, trailing slightly behind, glanced once over his shoulder toward Leonard Pike. His body remained taut, every line of him telegraphing distrust. The shepherd didn't forget easily, and neither, deep down, did Daniel. The clouds over the sea thickened, bruising into purple and grey, the kind of sky that promised both water and trouble. Seabrook Haven's harbour settled into uneasy quiet, as though the town itself was holding its breath. And in that silence, a child's sharp eyes and a dog's instinct had already seen what the adults tried to look past. The storm wasn't the only danger rolling toward Seabrook Haven. The storm had not yet broken, but Seabrook Haven carried the air of a place already under siege. The wind whistled low across the harbor, rattling halyards against their masts, like nervous fingers drumming on a table. Boats pitched gently in their slips, their bows pointing toward the gray swell beyond. It was late afternoon, that hour when shadows stretched long across the water, and the town seemed to wait for something it could not name. Daniel Hayes crouched on the dock, tightening a line against the rising tide. His hands moved with the steadiness of years, quick, efficient knots, each pull a small act of defiance against chaos. Behind him, Ava sat cross-legged on an overturned bucket, drawing in her sketchbook. The sound of her pencil scraping against paper was faint, almost lost beneath the whistle of the wind. But Daniel caught it, with the sensitivity of a man attuned to his daughter's small rituals. Argo lay at her feet, his body relaxed, but his eyes scanning constantly, never still for long. That was when the engines came. The low rumble at first seemed like distant thunder, but Daniel knew better. He straightened, the knot half finished, as 5 motorcycles rolled into view, chrome gleaming despite the dull light. They cut their way down Main Street like predators, through tall grass, scattering gulls into the air. At the head rode Mason Crow, his leather cut marked with the black tide insignia, his expression unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. The riders slowed as they reached the pier. Their engines idled with the guttural growl of caged beasts echoing off weathered buildings. Ava froze, pencil hovering above her page. She didn't need to hear clearly. She felt the vibration of those machines through the wood beneath her. Argo rose at once, shifting from rest into that combat-ready stance Daniel had learned not to underestimate. The shepherd positioned himself in front of the child, weight balanced, eyes burning like coals. Mason killed his engine first. The others followed, leaving a sudden, eerie silence broken only by the slap of waves. He swung off the bike with deliberate ease, boots crunching on gravel as he approached. His movements carried no hurry, but every step pressed against the air like a challenge. "Afternoon, Hayes," Mason drawled, his voice smooth, polished like a salesman's patter. "Peaceful little harbor you've got here. Shame if it soured." Daniel stood his ground, wiping his hands on a rag before folding his arms. He gave the man nothing, no greeting, no smile, not even the courtesy of a frown. "What do you want, Crow?" Mason removed his sunglasses slowly, hooking them into his vest pocket. His eyes were a shade of steel gray, the kind that could shift from charm to menace in a blink. "Now that's no way to welcome a neighbor. My boys and I, we're just looking out for communities like yours. Storms, accidents, fires. They have a way of happening when folks are stretched thin. Wouldn't it be wise to have someone making sure nothing unfortunate touches your boat, your little girl, your home?" His gaze slid past Daniel, lingering on Ava, who hugged her sketchbook tighter against her chest. Argo's growl vibrated low, deep, controlled, the sound of a fuse before it burns into flame. Daniel shifted just enough to block Mason's view of his daughter. His voice was calm, steady, like a man explaining simple math. "I've managed storms before. Accidents, too. I don't need insurance from men who make threats sound like favors." One of Mason's men chuckled darkly, spitting onto the dock. "You hear that, boss? The fisherman thinks he can stand against the tide." Mason lifted a hand, silencing the laughter. He studied Daniel for a long moment, his smile polite, but his eyes narrowing. "I respect that backbone, Hayes. Truly, I do. But courage without sense, that sinks faster than any boat." Daniel let the words hang. He didn't rise to them, didn't offer insult in return. He simply stood, arms folded, his silence heavier than argument. Ava watched him, wide-eyed, and though she couldn't catch every word, she understood the standoff in the taut line of his shoulders. Finally, Mason stepped closer, close enough for Daniel to smell the faint mix of oil and leather, the metallic tang of danger that clung to him. "Think about it," he said softly, almost kindly. "A small contribution each month, and the black tide makes sure your nets stay whole, your gear stays safe, your family sleeps easy. Seems like a bargain compared to what it'd cost if luck turned sour." Daniel shook his head once, decisive. "My family sleeps easy because we know where we stand. And it's not with men who come riding in like wolves pretending to herd sheep." The refusal landed like a slap. Mason's polite mask faltered, just for a breath, revealing the sharp edge beneath. He replaced it quickly, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, but the shift did not go unnoticed. "Well then," Mason said, stepping back, his boots heavy against the dock. "We'll let you stew on it. But storms have a way of testing a man, Hayes. Let's see how long your pride keeps you warm. He signaled to his men, and engines roared to life again, loud enough to rattle Ava's hearing aid. She winced, pressing her palms against her ears, but Argo leaned close, steadying her with his weight. Daniel watched silently as the riders pulled away, their thunder rolling down the street until only the gulls' cries returned. For a long moment, the dock was quiet again. The rope Daniel had been tying still dangled loose, forgotten. Ava clutched her sketchbook, eyes wide, searching her father's face for reassurance. He crouched beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "It's all right, little one." He wanted to scare us. "That's all." "But Argo knew," she whispered, her voice muffled by the buzz in her aid. She looked down at the shepherd, who remained stiff, his gaze fixed on the direction the motorcycles had gone. He knew they were bad. Daniel rested his hand on the dog's back, feeling the solid muscle beneath. "Yeah," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. He always does. Above them, the horizon darkened, clouds building heavy and low, the kind that carried both rain and reckoning. Daniel straightened slowly, his eyes fixed on that gathering line. He had faced storms at sea and storms in war, but this one felt different. This one walked on two legs, spoke in polite tones, and promised protection while sharpening knives behind its back. The black tide riders would return. Of that, Daniel had no doubt, and when they did, they would expect him to bend. He looked down at Ava, who leaned against Argo's steady flank, her eyes brave but questioning. He tightened the last knot on the rope, pulling it firm against the post, and muttered under his breath, "Then let them come." The next morning was heavy and humid, the kind of air that felt like a damp cloth laid over the town. A strange quiet clung to Seabrook Haven, as if the gulls themselves knew to keep their distance. Daniel and Ava walked together down toward the harbor, Argo pacing at their side, his head low but alert, as though every sound was a warning. They hadn't gone 10 steps along the pier before the riders returned. The roar of their engines split the morning calm, bouncing off the tin roofs and weathered clapboard storefronts. This time, there were more of them. 7 bikes, their riders spread in a loose formation that ate up the narrow road like a flood. Chrome caught the early light, and the black tide insignia glared back like an open challenge. Mason Crow led them, his face unreadable behind dark shades. Ava felt the vibration through the planks under her boots, and she tightened her grip on Argo's collar. The shepherd stiffened immediately, planting his paws as if bracing against an invisible push. His low growl was steady, controlled, the sound of a soldier recognizing the battlefield before anyone else. Daniel stepped slightly in front of his daughter. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but hard-edged. "What do you want this time, Crow?" Mason swung his leg off the bike, the others following suit. They spread casually, like wolves fanning out to encircle prey. "Now, Hayes," he said smoothly, "don't be so hostile. We're neighbors. Neighbors talk." The men around him chuckled, their laughter cutting into the quiet morning. One deliberately kicked over a fishing bucket, spilling a slick of bait fish across the dock. Another leaned against a piling, picking his teeth with a pocket knife, eyes never leaving Ava. Before Daniel could answer, another sound joined the scene. The crunch of gravel, the heavy tread of boots. Deputy Wilkins appeared at the edge of the pier, his khaki uniform damp with sweat, his hand resting near his holstered sidearm. Relief flickered across Ava's face. Someone from the law was here. Surely that meant the rules still mattered. But Wilkins didn't move closer. He stopped a good 20 feet away, his posture uncertain, his eyes darting between the riders and Daniel. "Everything all right here, gentlemen?" he called out, his tone too light, like a man whistling in a graveyard. Mason turned his head slowly, smiling with all the warmth of ice. "Deputy, good to see you keeping an eye on the town. Nothing to worry about. Just a conversation with Mr. Hayes here, talking about community safety." One of his men snorted. "Yeah, safety." Daniel's jaw tightened. "This doesn't look like safety to me." Wilkins shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering near his belt, but never daring to touch the gun. Now, let's not escalate. These men, they've got rights same as anyone, as long as nobody's breaking laws." His voice faltered. Ava's young eyes flicked between them, confusion knotting in her chest. She might not have heard every word, but she read body language like a second language. Her father standing tall, the bikers smirking, and the deputy shrinking into his own uniform. The badge gleamed in the light, but it meant nothing if the man behind it bent under another's stare. Mason stepped closer, his boots thudding against the dock. "See, Hayes, even the law knows better than to pick fights where none need to be. That's wisdom. You'd do well to learn it." Daniel didn't move. His silence was louder than argument. Argo pressed closer to Ava, his body rigid, his nose twitching, as if catching the sour scent of fear on the air. The shepherd's growl deepened, vibrating against the girl's small hand. She clung to him, her hearing aid buzzing faintly from the engine's idle rumble. One of the riders leaned toward another, speaking just loud enough for Ava to catch the shape of the words. "Told you. Cops won't lift a finger." They both grinned, wide and mean, as if the game had already been won. Wilkins cleared his throat, but the sound cracked. Best be on your way soon, fellas. Don't want folks nervous with the storm coming." His words were empty, weightless. His eyes slid away from Daniel's, away from Ava's. Mason tipped his head, a mock salute. "You heard the deputy. We'll be going. But Hayes, think about what I said. Storms tear things apart. People get hurt. Nets snap. Fires start. All preventable. With the right friends." He turned back toward his bike, the others following, their boots and laughter leaving bruises in the air. Engines roared to life again, drowning out the gulls, rattling Ava's chest until she pressed her hands to her ears. When the riders finally vanished down the road, Daniel exhaled slowly. He turned to Wilkins, his voice low but carrying an edge Ava had never heard from him before. "You saw that? You did nothing." The deputy's face flushed red. Look, it's complicated. Sheriff Reynolds says not to stir up trouble with these men. Says it's safer for everyone if we what?" Daniel snapped. "Bow our heads while they carve up this town." Wilkins swallowed hard, eyes dropping to the planks. He muttered something about protocol, but even he didn't sound convinced. Without another word, he turned and walked away, boots heavy, shoulders hunched under invisible chains. Silence stretched across the pier once more. Only the sound of waves against pilings remained. Ava stared after the deputy, her chest tight. She was only 6, but she understood more than anyone thought. She understood that when the men with badges looked away, the bad men grew bolder. She reached up, tugging at her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice small but steady. "The police won't help us." Daniel looked down at her, his heart aching at the certainty in her tone. He knelt, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll help ourselves," he said quietly. Argo stood beside them, eyes still fixed on the road where the riders had vanished, his whole body poised like a promise. The storm clouds gathered thicker over Seabrook Haven, but the greater storm, Daniel realized, had already arrived. The bell over Maggie's diner door jingled, though it sounded more like a tired sigh than a greeting. By the time Daniel, Ava, and Argo stepped inside, half the town was already gathered. The air smelled of fried fish, black coffee, and damp coats drying in the heat. But underneath lingered something heavier, fear mixed with stubborn pride. Ava slid into their usual corner booth, clutching her sketchbook against her chest. Argo curled at her feet, though not in rest. His eyes tracked every movement, every shift of posture, like he understood the stakes as well as anyone. Daniel joined the circle forming around the center tables. Men with weather-cracked hands and women with faces lined from years of salt wind filled the room. Old Doyle sat, hunched near the end, his cane propped against the table, his eyes sharp despite his age. The conversations were already rising and breaking like waves on rocks. "They're not bluffing," muttered Ben Turner, a fisherman with too much debt and too little catch. His thick hands rubbed nervously at a chipped mug. "We've all seen what happens in other towns down the coast. Boats burned, traps cut loose, gear smashed to bits. We can't afford that." "Can't afford?" Doyle barked, slamming his hand flat on the table. The sound made Ava jump, but Argo didn't so much as twitch. "Can't afford is bending your back to men who never earned the right to stand here. This harbor was built by our fathers' hands, and their fathers before them. We don't bend." His cane rattled as he struck it against the floor for emphasis. A few men nodded, their jaws set, but others avoided his gaze. Sandra Kelly, who ran the chandlery with her husband, shook her head slowly. "Doyle, principle doesn't mend nets or pay mortgages. If giving them a cut keeps our children safe, keeps our businesses alive, then maybe swallowing pride is cheaper than losing everything." The room hummed with agreement from some, disapproval from others. Daniel stayed silent for a moment, listening, measuring. He could feel Ava's eyes on him from across the room, searching his face the way she always did when the world felt uncertain. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but steady, like an anchor line cast in heavy seas. "Compromise with men like Crow doesn't buy safety. It rents fear. And the rent only goes up." The words drew a murmur through the room. Ben Turner scowled, his shoulders tight. "Easy for you to say, Hayes. You've got your Navy pension, that dog, your steady charters when the tourists roll in. Some of us are one bad week from losing it all. If paying keeps the black tide away, maybe it's worth it." "You think they'll go away?" Doyle scoffed. "No, boy. They'll dig in. Like barnacles on a hull. You scrape them off once, they just grow back thicker. You pay once, you'll pay forever." Voices rose again, sharp, overlapping. Some sided with Doyle, some with Sandra, many caught in between. The storm outside pressed against the windows, a low whistle in the eaves, like the sea itself was listening to the quarrel. Ava flipped open her sketchbook, pressing her pencil hard against the page. She couldn't follow every word. Her hearing aid crackled with the clash of voices. But she saw the tension, the way hands gripped mugs like weapons, the way eyes narrowed and shoulders stiffened. She drew lines, jagged and dark, across the page. Argo rested his chin on her knee, steady, solid. His calm was the only thing that made sense. "Let's say we fight," muttered one younger fisherman, barely 30, his cheeks raw from wind. "What then? You think Deputy Wilkins is going to stand with us? You saw him this morning. Man barely looked at Crow without sweating through his shirt." "That's just it," Doyle cut in. "Law won't stand with us, so we stand for ourselves." His voice wavered with age, but his conviction cut sharp as a blade. "We've weathered storms. We'll weather this one too." Sandra folded her arms, her voice tight. "Storms don't come armed with chains and knives, Doyle. These men are different. You think Argo here can fight them all off?" She glanced toward the shepherd, but her gaze faltered when she saw the quiet ferocity in his eyes. Daniel straightened. "Argo's trained to protect, but he's not the answer. The answer is us. A community that bends out of fear is already broken. If we hold together, if we watch each other's backs the way we always have, Crow can't break us." For a moment, silence fell. The storm rattled the windows again, punctuating the weight of his words. Then Ben Turner exhaled sharply. "Hold together. Look around, Hayes. We're already splitting at the seams." He wasn't wrong. The diner felt like a hull straining against the waves, each voice another creak in the wood. Half the room stood with Doyle and Daniel, fire in their eyes. The other half sat with Sandra and Ben, the weary look of people who had carried too many debts, too many winters, and feared they had no fight left. Ava closed her sketchbook, sliding out of the booth. She crossed to her father silently, Argo pacing behind her like a shadow. She slipped her small hand into Daniel's, looking up at him with quiet certainty. Her presence steadied him more than the agreement of any man in that room. Old Doyle caught the sight, his weathered face softening. He tapped his cane once more, softer this time. "There," he said, voice rough but gentler. "That's why we don't bend. Not for ourselves. For the little ones watching." The words sank into the room like stones into water, rippling outward. The arguments didn't vanish. Fear still lingered, compromise still tempted. But something had shifted. The town was no longer just weighing pride against safety. They were weighing the kind of world they would leave for children like Ava. Daniel squeezed his daughter's hand and met Doyle's gaze. The old fisherman nodded once, as if passing a torch. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon, low and warning. The real storm had yet to strike, but Seabrook Haven was already in its grip. By late afternoon, Seabrook Haven braced for the storm. Wind howled in from the sea, bending flags sideways and driving gulls inland. Salt and rain thickened the air, clinging to skin like a warning. For Daniel Hayes, storms spoke their own language, shifts in tide, sudden silences, the sharp drop of a barometer. He knew when whispers would turn to screams. By evening, he had made his decision. Inside their cottage, Ava sat cross-legged on the floor, coloring beneath the soft glow of a lamp. Argo, the scarred shepherd, lay beside her, ears twitching with each gust rattling the windows. The radio crackled with Coast Guard warnings. Power failures, flooding, isolation. Daniel switched it off. "Pack up, sweetheart," he said gently. "We're heading to higher ground." Ava studied his face, reading seriousness in his eyes more than his words. "The lighthouse?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Jonah Whitlock will keep the light on." Jonah was a recluse, whispered about as a ghost who spoke to the sea. But Daniel knew better. He was a soldier who had survived by choosing solitude. Within the hour, Daniel, Ava, and Argo climbed the rain-lashed road toward the headland. Ava fought the gale, her hood clutched tight, while Argo moved like a wall at her side, steadying her when the wind shoved too hard. Above them, the lighthouse loomed, its beam cutting arcs across the storm. Jonah opened the oak door with a lantern in hand. His beard was gray, his eyes sharp despite shadow. "Figured you'd come," he rumbled. "Get in before the wind skins you alive." Inside smelled of kerosene and salt. Charts and tools lined the walls in perfect military order. A fire in the cast-iron stove spread heat into the damp air. Ava slipped off her coat and knelt close to the warmth, Argo stretching at her feet. Daniel set their duffel down and met Jonah's gaze. "Appreciate this." Jonah waved the words away. "A storm like this, nobody should be down by the harbor." His eyes flicked to Argo, who watched him with the intensity of a soldier sizing up another. "Military dog?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "He was my cousin's. He's ours now." Jonah's expression softened. "Good. Dogs remember what men forget. They don't unlearn loyalty." The words settled over them like a benediction. For the first time that day, Daniel let out a breath of relief. The lighthouse was solid. Ava would sleep under walls no storm could break. Yet when night fell, the storm pressed harder against the tower. The sea hurled itself at the cliffs, wind moaning like a wounded giant. Jonah sat at the scarred wooden table, lantern low, hands curled around a chipped mug. Daniel joined him, restless. Ava curled on the rug, Argo's head heavy on her lap. Jonah broke the silence first. "You know Pike wasn't chosen as harbor master. He bought it, with debts he can't pay. Atlantic City, dice, cards. Men like that get owned." Daniel frowned, remembering Pike's nervous eyes whenever Mason Crow leaned too close. "So the riders," Jonah nodded. "Could be them, could be bigger. All I know is Pike makes late calls, careful ones, not the kind a man makes to his wife." The words hit heavy. Daniel thought of the riders circling Seabrook Haven, of deputies turning quiet. Storm outside, storm inside. Someone had opened the door. Jonah tapped the table, then pulled out an old Coast Guard comms box, wires neat, dials polished. "Folks think it's dead. I kept it alive. Habit of a soldier. You never throw away a lifeline." Daniel felt a flicker of hope. But before he could speak, Ava raised her hand in a small, deliberate gesture, fist closing, then slicing outward. Argo's ears twitched. Without hesitation, he padded to the door and sat rigid, posture like a statue. Daniel blinked. "Ava, what was that?" She smiled faintly. "Aunt Sarah taught me. It means God." The realization struck like lightning. Sarah, his late cousin, hadn't just left him her partner's dog. She had left Ava a guardian trained with signals Daniel had never learned. Jonah's eyes narrowed. "Special Forces dog, isn't he? That's no regular canine." Before Daniel could answer, the storm's roar deepened. Beneath it, another sound. Engines grinding up the cliff road. His pulse spiked. "They followed," Jonah muttered, reaching for his shotgun. Headlights flared across the windows, then vanished. Engines cut. Silence. A hunter's silence. The pounding came next, shaking the oak door on its hinges. "Whitlock," a voice bellowed. "Open up. The harbor master says you've got visitors." Jonah's jaw clenched. Leonard. Pike had led them here. The door buckled on the next slam. Daniel crouched beside Ava. "Stay with Argo." "Don't move unless I say." Her hand closed tight on the shepherd's collar. The door burst inward. 3 bikers stormed in, 2 with pistols, 1 with a knife. Rain gleamed on their boots. Jonah leveled the shotgun, but Ava moved first. Her hand rose, firm and steady. "Argo!" The shepherd launched. He hit the knife wielder with surgical precision, jaws clamping the wrist until bone groaned. The blade hit the floor. The man screamed under the dog's weight. Daniel crashed into the second biker, twisting his pistol hand until the weapon clattered away. A sharp strike dropped the man unconscious. Jonah's shotgun roared once, a warning blast that shattered a lamp and froze the last intruder in place. Ava raised her hand again, 2 fingers down, palm forward. Her voice rang clear. "Hold!" Argo froze, jaws still locked but not breaking skin, his growl low and thunderous. The final biker's pistol trembled before Daniel ripped it free and shoved him against the wall. Jonah pressed the shotgun barrel to his cheek. Silence slammed into the room, heavier than the storm. Ava knelt where she had begun, hand trembling, eyes calm. Argo returned to her side, posture still alert, but softened by her touch. Daniel's chest tightened. In her, he saw Sarah's faith, an inheritance written not in blood, but in trust. Jonah lowered his gun slowly, awe shadowing his face. "That's Special Forces work. I've seen it before." The bikers were bound with rope, curses drowned by the storm's howl. Daniel brushed damp hair from Ava's forehead. "You did good, sweetheart." Her fragile smile broke through. "He listened to me, Daddy." Daniel met Argo's eyes, then hers. His heart swelled with fierce pride. He always will. Outside, the storm battered the tower like an enraged beast. But inside, something stronger had taken root. They weren't just hiding anymore. They had stood their ground, tested and proven unbreakable. And for the first time, Daniel believed Seabrook Haven had a fighting chance. The storm struck the lighthouse in waves, each gust battering the stone tower as if to rip it from the cliff. Rain slashed against the windows, hissing like knives. Inside, Daniel and Jonah had just bound 3 bikers when the lights died. The stove flame guttered, lanterns flickered, and the generator fell silent. Darkness swallowed the room. Ava gasped, clutching Argo's chest. The shepherd trembled with energy, growling vibrating beneath her palm. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, anchoring herself to his steadiness. Jonah cursed, fumbling with the old Coast Guard radio. "Dead." "Generators shot," he muttered. "Storm, or sabotage." His gaze cut to the captives. One biker smirked. "It's easy to lose folks in a storm." Daniel tightened his bonds until the man hissed, "You'll stay put." But unease gnawed at him. Blackouts were covered, and cover meant opportunity. Ava leaned closer to Argo, trusting his calm more than her ears, her hearing aid buzzing with static. Daniel brushed hair from her face. "Whatever happens, stay behind him." The tower groaned under another gust. Then came a sound layered beneath the storm. Boots on wet gravel. Argo stiffened, growling and deepening. Jonah's eyes met Daniel's. No words. The riders were coming. Shadows climbed the cliff path. 6, maybe more. The first blows rattled the oak door, then splintered it wide. 3 riders surged in, pistols and knives gleaming in lantern light. Daniel moved fast, his soldiers' training snapping alive. He dropped one with a nerve hold, crumpling him silently. The second lunged with a blade. Daniel wrenched his arm until the knife fell, then choked him unconscious. Jonah's shotgun roared, tearing through the third man's shoulder. They grappled on the floor, blood blooming across Jonah's shirt. More riders burst through. Argo exploded into motion, jaws clamping on a gunman's wrist. The pistol fired into the ceiling as the man collapsed. Ava's hand shot up, fingers forming a signal Sarah had once shown her. "Hold." Argo froze, pinning the man without tearing flesh. Discipline, not frenzy. Daniel disarmed another with ruthless efficiency. Jonah, bleeding but unbroken, fought with a broken chair leg, driving his assailant back. More shadows filled the doorway until Daniel seized the shotgun, blasting once to scatter them. Smoke and blood thickened the air. But one rider lingered, a scarred brute with a knife. He barreled in, fury in his eyes. Jonah faltered, his wound slowing him. Daniel raised his pistol too late. Argo struck first. The shepherd launched, colliding mid-stride. The knife clattered free as the man slammed to the floor. Ava's voice cut through thunder. "Hold!" The dog obeyed with chilling precision. His jaws locked on the man's forearm, nerves crushed, weapon hand useless. But flesh spared. He pinned the biker flat, growl vibrating like a storm contained. Daniel froze, breath caught. His daughter, no taller than the shepherd's shoulders, stood steady, commanding him with a soldier's authority. Jonah lowered his weapon slowly, awe breaking through the blood on his face. "I'll be damned. That's special ops work. Not a pet. A soldier." Daniel's chest swelled with pride and grief. He remembered Sarah's voice in that hospital bed. "Keep him with Emma. Promise me." Now he understood. The scarred biker trembled, pinned beneath Argo's control. "Get him off me. Ain't natural." But his eyes betrayed awe. Daniel tied the man's wrists, muttering, "You should thank him. He spared you." Argo eased back only when Ava lowered her hand. He returned to her side, pressing his scarred head to her chest. She whispered into his fur, "Good boy." "You did it." Jonah leaned heavy on the wall, blood dripping but eyes fierce. "I saw dogs like that in Nam. Could drop a man faster than a bullet and stop on command, but never from a child." Daniel looked at his daughter, hands still buried in Argo's fur, and realized something deeper. The shepherd wasn't just protecting her. He was teaching her how to stand. Outside, the storm screamed louder, rattling stone and glass. But within the battered lighthouse, the riders had been driven back. The captives lay bound, the wounded groaned, and a little girl stood unshaken beside a soldier who walked on 4 legs. "They'll come again," Daniel said grimly. Jonah's grip tightened on his chair-leg weapon. "Then we make sure they learn what this family is made of." Ava stroked Argo's fur, whispering so softly it almost vanished into the storm. "We're not afraid, not as long as we stand together." And in that moment, Daniel believed her. By dawn, the storm had worsened, turning streets into rivers and the sky into a gray wall of water. Families staggered toward the only building still lit, the community hall. Built after the war for weddings and suppers, tonight it was a cage. 2 bikers stood at the door, leather vests dark with rain. "Move along, shelter inside, everyone gets checked in." Inside, fear thickened the air. Families huddled on the floor, benches shoved against the walls. Children clutched sodden toys, elders whispered prayers. At the front, Mason Crow paced like a man claiming a throne. His coat dripped, his boots echoed. "You're safe here," he said with rough charisma. Storms tearing the coast apart. Power's gone in half the county, but the black tide riders make sure no harm comes to Seabrook Haven. Some whispered relief. Others heard the truth beneath the words. Protection came with a price. His men moved through the crowd, collecting radios and murmuring about donations. Fear silenced protests. Old Doyle, leaning on his cane, muttered, "Shakedown dressed as charity." A few nodded. Others hushed him, afraid. When a rider barked at Mrs. Johnson to quiet her crying baby, her husband stood tall. "She's a baby. She cries." Mason's hand shot up. "Enough. We're not monsters." For a flicker, something human showed in his eyes, then vanished. The storm pounded harder, rattling rafters. Lightning cast jagged shadows across the walls. Mason's voice rose above it. When the sky clears, Seabrook Haven will be under our protection, and protection has a price. His words landed like a hammer. Then the roof gave way. With a crack like bones breaking, a beam splintered. Wood and plaster crashed into the hall. Families screamed, diving for cover. Ben Turner, the fisherman, was struck and pinned beneath timbers. Mrs. Johnson screamed as debris rolled toward her infant. "Argo!" Ava cried. The shepherd lunged, bracing himself against the beam, shielding the baby with his body. Muscles quivered but held. Ava clawed at splinters until Daniel pulled mother and child free. Jonah Whitlock, pale from his wound, staggered forward. He pressed his shoulder against the fallen beam, teeth clenched. "Go! Get them out!" "Jonah," Daniel tried, but the old man shoved him away. "You've got your girl and your town to save. This one's mine." With Jonah straining, Daniel dragged Ben free. Blood streaked the fisherman's temple. Jonah locked eyes with Daniel, silent understanding passing between two soldiers. "Take care of them," he rasped, "and keep that dog close." Then his knees buckled. The beam crashed down, burying him beneath. "No!" Daniel lunged, but riders grabbed him back. Dust filled the air. Ava's sobs tore through the chaos. Argo pressed against her, trembling, his eyes locked on the wreckage. Silence fell, broken only by the storm and the baby's cries. Mason barked orders. "Get the wounded clear! Secure the hall!" His voice carried urgency, but Daniel barely heard over the roar of grief. He held Ava close as she whispered, "Why, Daddy? Why did he do that?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Because he believed in us. He gave us a chance." Around them, townsfolk stirred. They had seen Jonah stand against the storm, giving his life so others might live. His sacrifice was a spark. Old Doyle's voice rang rough but fierce. "We'll not bow to fear. Jonah's blood won't be spilled for nothing." Daniel lifted his gaze to Mason. For the first time, he saw doubt flicker in the biker's eyes. Then came a cry. Ben Turner was fading fast. "We need to move him," Daniel barked. Fear paralyzed the crowd, until Mason stepped forward. "I'll help." For a heartbeat, the hall froze, the enemy at Daniel's side. But Mason knelt, broad hands reaching for the beam pinning Ben's legs. His eyes showed only urgency. "On 3, Daniel said. Together they heaved, freeing Ben. Daniel bound wounds while Mason steadied the fisherman's head with surprising gentleness. "Easy, big man. Stay with us. Get something to carry him." A rider brought a broken door. Mason helped lift Ben onto it. Whispers rippled. An enemy carrying their own. Ava stared at Mason. "You helped him," she said softly. Mason's expression cracked. "Man's hurt. Doesn't matter what side he's on." Old Doyle muttered, "Maybe the man's got a conscience after all." Daniel checked Ben's pulse. "You know what you're doing?" Mason gave a humorless smile. 3 tours in the Corps. Seen plenty of patch jobs." The revelation landed like a stone. Not just a biker boss, once a soldier. Together they freed another trapped woman. Mason barking at his own riders for rope. Daniel bracing as they pulled her clear. She sobbed into Mason's shoulder, and he bore it silently. Whispers grew. The man who threatened them hours ago now carried their wounded. When the roof rattled again, Daniel said, "We need to move. The lighthouse will hold." Fear spread, but Mason surprised them all. "He's right. My men will guard the column. Nobody gets left behind." Old Doyle barked bitterly. "Expect us to trust you." Mason loomed over him. No, but trust this. I don't want more bodies buried tonight. We make it through together, or none of us make it. Silence. Then Ava stepped forward, Argo at her side. Her voice was small but fierce. Jonah died to save us. If you mean what you say, prove it. Help Daddy protect Seabrook Haven. Mason knelt, rain-streaked face lined with ghosts. He met her gaze, then nodded once. I'll prove it, little one. For the first time, Daniel believed him. Enough to take the next step together. Enough to carry the injured side by side, not as enemies, but as survivors. Thunder shook the hall. But inside, something had shifted. Jonah's sacrifice had sown unity. Mason's actions had planted the faintest seed of alliance. The storm had not broken them. Against all odds, it had begun to forge them into something stronger. And as Argo pressed against Ava, his eyes fixed on Mason with canine judgment, Daniel remembered Jonah's last words. Keep that dog close. Perhaps the old man had meant more than he realized. The lighthouse groaned as the storm hammered its walls, the beam cutting across waves like black mountains. Inside, families huddled in the keeper's quarters, their whispers trembling like candle flames. Daniel stood near the stairwell, Ava pressed against his side, Argo never leaving her. Mason Crow paced the wall, his riders restless. In the storage room, 3 bound men sat bruised but calm. Something about them had always been off. Their discipline, their restraint. Mason leaned forward, voice like gravel. You're too quiet for riders. Talk or ride the storm in chains. The leader lifted his head, lip split but voice steady. We're not your enemies. DEA. Operation Coastal Watch. 14 months under. The words froze the room. Old Doyle spat. DEA? Hell of a disguise. Another prisoner added. And Mason isn't what you think. He's been feeding us intel. He's an informant. Gasps rippled. Ava clutched Argo tighter. Daniel's jaw clenched. You? Mason didn't flinch. I cut a deal. Played devil to gut him from inside. My line was no civilians, no kids. When Whitaker pushed it, I knew he'd crossed. The name struck Daniel cold. Whitaker? The agent nodded grimly. Inspector Whitaker, Coast Guard. He feeds the cartel patrol gaps, clearance codes. Without him, nothing moves. Memory stabbed Daniel. Whitaker's polished shoes on the pier, his quiet words with Pike. Ava tugged his sleeve, whispering, Daddy, it was him, the shiny shoes man. He told Mr. Pike to scare you. Said scaring me would make you bend. Her voice broke. Argo pressed against her, steady as stone. Silence fell, heavier than thunder. Old Doyle slammed his cane. The bastard put a target on a child. Daniel gathered her close, grief and rage boiling. Mason's voice cut raw. That confirms it. Whitaker's the rot. I never ordered kids touched. That wasn't me. That was him. The agent leaned forward. Little one, are you certain? Ava lifted her head, steady now. I'm sure. I won't forget things like that. Her words were nails in stone. Even hardened riders bowed their heads at the truth. Daniel's stomach churned. The puzzle pieces locked. Pike's debts, the riders circling, Jonah's death, all Whitaker's games. Mason straightened, his eyes burning. So now you know. You want Whitaker gone? You need me. You need them. He nodded toward the agents. The room erupted. Doyle snarled, "Trust him." After the threats, the blood, Sandra Kelly snapped back. He carried Ben Turner out when the roof fell. Without him, Ben would be dead. A fisherman spat. "And we're meant to forget the swagger? Laughing when the sheriff ran?" The agent interjected softly. "Not an act. Survival. Without Mason, we'd never have gotten this close." But suspicion thickened like smoke. "Intel doesn't comfort a child," another muttered. Then Ava spoke, her hand on Argo's back. Argo didn't think he was bad. The room quieted. Mason bowed his head slightly. "Your dog's smarter than most men." Daniel's gut twisted. He remembered Mason's threats at the dock, but also his roar of effort hauling wreckage off Ben Turner. Trust wasn't a switch. It was a wound. He cleared his throat. "The truth's ugly. Whitaker's pulling strings. Mason's been close enough to smell the fire. That makes him useful. Don't mistake useful for trustworthy." Mason met the fury without flinching. "I don't expect forgiveness, but if you want Whitaker to fall, you'll need me." Sandra folded her arms. "So the choice is simple. Fight together or splinter apart." Doyle muttered about bargains with devils, but even he didn't slam his fist. The storm outside rattled the glass. Ava whispered to Daniel, "Jonah said we're strongest when we don't stand alone." Her words twisted the knife of grief. Jonah's sacrifice was still raw, but she was right. Daniel exhaled. "We don't have to like him, don't even have to forgive him. But for now, he stands with us." Murmurs spread, reluctant nods, bitter scowls. But the thread was tied. Mason inclined his head, not in triumph, but acknowledgement. Argo lowered to the floor, eyes never leaving him, measured, watchful. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, a fragile alliance formed. Seabrook Haven's fate no longer rested on stone walls or guns alone. It rested on whether fractured hearts could bind long enough to face the greater darkness waiting beyond the waves. The hurricane's eye had passed, leaving Seabrook Haven hushed and drowned. Streets were canals, shutters banged against half-submerged storefronts. Fishing boats lay scattered on porches like toys. A weary caravan waded through black water, lanterns bobbing like faint stars. Daniel led, Ava perched on his shoulders, her arms tight around his neck. Argo forged ahead, pausing often to sniff and redirect. Twice already, the shepherd had steered them clear of hidden wreckage. When he froze, growl low, Daniel raised a hand. The line halted. Ripples stirred unnaturally in a dark pool. Lantern light revealed wires snaking beneath, live power lines. Daniel barked an order, and the group shifted left, fear whispering through them. Ava leaned down, whispering, "Argo says it's okay now." But danger pressed at every step. The collapse of roofs, sudden cracks of timbers, unseen currents, tugging like hands. Near Harbor Street, floodwater surged to Daniel's waist, nearly pulling Ava from his shoulders. Sandra Kelly stumbled with her infant, caught only by a fisherman's grip. Then Argo barked thrice, urgent, sharp. Ava recognized it instantly. Danger! Daniel spotted the drifting wreck of a roof, nails bristling, bearing down on them. "Left! Now!" he roared. Survivors splashed to the church steps, the debris scraping past with sparks. Relief came shaky, whispered. Argo moved forward again, unshaken. Daniel whispered, "Good boy." The climb toward the lighthouse was worse. Slick mud, run-off washing stones down the slope. 4 men carried Ben Turner on a stretcher, his bandaged head lolling, skin pale. Daniel checked him twice. Pressure was building in the skull. Mason Crow moved at the stretcher's side, his riders cut, stripped, and cast into the flood. He was just a man now, boots caked in mud. At a narrow washout, the stretcher tilted. A carrier slipped, the fisherman's body sliding toward the drop. Daniel shouted, but Mason was already diving. He caught the stretcher's frame, boots braced against a root, body trembling with strain. For one terrifying second he teetered, then with a guttural roar, hauled the load back level. "Lift!" he barked. The carriers scrambled, stabilizing. Ben still breathed. Daniel glanced at Mason, sprawled in the muck, chest heaving. Ava's small voice whispered in awe, "He saved Mr. Turner." For the first time, Daniel saw not the gang leader who had swaggered into town, but a soldier stripped raw by choice. "Don't let him die," Mason muttered hoarsely. Daniel nodded. "I'll do everything I can." Argo padded close, sniffed Mason, then settled beside the stretcher. His acceptance was quiet, but it carried weight. From then on, Mason never strayed from Ben's side. At last the lighthouse crest loomed. But the beacon was dark. Survivors faltered, their hope dimming. Sandra's voice trembled. "The light's out." Argo surged up the steps, posture steady. Ava whispered, "Argo says it's okay." Daniel pushed open the heavy door. Inside smelled of oil and ozone. Furniture was shifted, wires trailing. Lantern light flickered over 3 men in soaked leathers, crouched over the gutted generator. Prisoners, supposed riders they'd captured earlier. Daniel drew his knife. "Back!" The nearest man raised grease-streaked hands. "Easy. We're not who you think. My name's Delaney. DEA. Operation Coastal Watch. 14 months embedded." Murmurs rippled. Mason stiffened but stayed silent. Daniel's voice was steel. "After what you did to this town?" Delaney shook his head. "Not us. Not the way you think. Mason's been our informant. Playing both sides, feeding intel." Daniel's stomach churned. "Then who's behind this?" Delaney's eyes hardened. "Inspector Whitaker. Coast Guard. He's the one running product through these towns. The riders. Pike's debts. It's all his cover." The name landed like a hammer. Doyle cursed, knuckling white on his cane. Ava tugged Daniel's sleeve, voice small but fierce. "Daddy, it was him. The shiny shoes man. I saw him with Mr. Pike. He said, 'Scaring me would make you bend.'" Her voice broke, but her eyes stayed clear. Argo pressed closer, growl low. Daniel's throat burned as he held her. She heard him. She saw him. Delaney leaned forward. "That confirms it. Whitaker thinks the storms erased his tracks. But if we get this generator running, we call him in. Backup comes. Not for Mason, but for him." The words split the room. Some muttered disbelief. Others stared at Mason like he carried 2 faces. Mason finally spoke, voice stripped of swagger. "I don't expect forgiveness. But if you want Whitaker down, you'll need what I know." Ava's voice rose, small, but steady. "Jonah died, so we'd stand together. If we fight each other, we waste what he gave us." Her words cut deeper than thunder. Daniel weighed it. His daughter's courage, Argo's steady presence, the raw truth in Delaney's eyes. Finally, he growled, "Fine. But if you cross us..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Delaney nodded. Understood. At that moment, the generator roared. Light flooded the room. Then the beacon blazed to life, cutting its sweep across the sea. Survivors gasped, relief breaking like dawn. For the first time since the storm began, light stood against the dark. Daniel pulled Ava close, Argo pressing against them both. The shepherd's eyes glowed steady, as if he too understood. The storm wasn't their only enemy. The true battle was against betrayal rooted in polished shoes and a uniform's lie. And now, with truth burning from a child's memory, Seabrook Haven had the beginning of resistance. The lighthouse's main room had become an infirmary. Tables dragged from the kitchen, blankets spread across stone, lanterns burning in a shaky ring of light. Outside, the storm clawed at the walls, but inside, only ragged breathing and the hum of the generator filled the air. Ben Turner lay at the center, his broad frame shrunken against a crude cot. His lips were blue, his body twitching. Daniel knew the signs: intracranial bleeding. Hours left at most. He had seen this on desert battlefields, in tents that smelled of iodine and blood. But this wasn't a stranger. This was Ben, who had taught Ava to tie her first knot, who whistled shanties on the docks. Daniel laid out the meager supplies: a fishing knife boiled clean, strips of linen, an old brace from Jonah's chest. Not enough, but all they had. Mason Crow stood across from him, sleeves rolled, hands scrubbed raw. The smirk was gone. In its place, a soldier's focus. Have you ever done this before? Field expedient decompression. Twice. Saved one, lost the other. Daniel steadied his breath. This is Ben's only chance. Mason's jaw set. Then we won't let him die. Ava sat by Argo, clutching the shepherd's collar. The dog's head rested on his paws, amber eyes fixed on Ben, ears twitching at each convulsion. Daniel bent to his daughter. Sweetheart, I need you to keep Argo calm. Can you do that? She nodded fiercely. We'll be a team. The room hushed as Daniel began, knife flashing, clothes pressed to control the flow, Mason's lantern steady over his shoulder. Their rhythm found itself, medic and soldier, untrusting but united. Then came the worst part. Daniel set the brace, guiding the blade with painful care. One wrong move and Ben was gone. Sweat streaked his face. The sound of bone giving way made stomachs twist. Fluid drained. Blood spilled. Ben's body jerked, then stilled. Gasps rippled. Daniel pressed on, cleaning, stitching, fingers aching. At last, he sagged back. It's done. Silence stretched until Ben's chest rose in a steadier rhythm, lips pinking faintly. A sigh slipped out, almost relief. The room exhaled as one. Ava darted forward, eyes wide. You saved him. Daniel wiped his brow. We gave him a chance. The rest is up to him. Mason lowered the lantern. Mud-streaked, eyes shadowed. He looked different. Not bad for a fisherman. Not bad for a biker. The tension eased, just for a beat. Argo curled at Ben's side, protective sentinel. Ava's hand stroked his scarred ear, steady as a heartbeat. Delaney, the captured rider turned agent, stepped forward. You've got more than a medic's hands. You've got a leader. Daniel shook his head. I'm just a father keeping his daughter safe. Delaney didn't argue. He turned back to the comms, sleeves rolled, headphones crooked to one ear. The radio whispered with static. Then a clipped voice cut through. Sector 9. This channel is restricted. Identify yourselves. Special Agent Delaney, DEA. Operation Coastal Watch. Verification code Omega 79, he snapped. Silence. Then another voice slid onto the line, smooth, lacquered. Agent Delaney, Inspector Whitaker. I understand you've had a difficult night. The room stiffened. Old Doyle's cane thudded against the floor. Mason's fists curled. Delaney's voice hardened. We have your schedules, your ledgers, your payoffs. You've used federal cover to run cartel products. You're finished. Whitaker chuckled softly, as if humoring a child. Storms inspire rumors. Better to come ashore where facts breathe. Your facts are children threatened, Delaney shot back. Your facts are a dead lighthouse keeper. Silence. Then Whitaker's tone shifted, silk with a barb. Sometimes men like Mason Crow are useful. Better devils to hold back worse. All eyes slid to Mason. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Delaney pressed. We know your rendezvous, tonight, inside the South Inlet. You won't hide it. Another soft laugh. In this weather, you'll drown yourselves. Then colder. Push me, Agent, and civilian blood will be on your hands. Delaney cut the transmission. His jaw was tight. That's his warning. And tell. He tapped the chart spread on the table. South Inlet, cannery lot. 2 Coast Guard trucks, 3 unmarked vans, 1 skiff. He'll either move it inside or leave it on the dock to taunt us. Mason stepped in, tracing routes with scarred knuckles. 2 on the pier, 1 with optics on the lamp. Quick exit if spooked. He's arrogant enough to stage it outside. You know this, Doyle rasped, because you've run it. Mason met his gaze, unflinching. Because I've been fed timings before. Not enough to burn him. Tonight, we have enough. Argo padded closer, nose low over the chart. Ava's hand tightened in his fur. Her hearing aid hummed as she whispered, Argo says it's true. The shepherd's amber eyes locked on Mason, not hostile. Judging. Delaney straightened. We need 2 things, a signal to my cutter, and a town willing to move as one. Daniel scanned the room. Weary faces, children pressed to mothers, Doyle pale but steady. His hand brushed Ava's crown. You won't get another window, he said. If the eye closes, comms die, courage dies. Sandra lifted her chin. What do you need? 8, maybe 10 able hands, Delaney replied. Doyle, Diego, 2 deckhands. Mason's 3, who can still walk. Hayes, we need you. Murmurs rose. Ava's eyes fixed on her father. The same question he'd seen in every battlefield glance. Will you come back? He crouched. I have to help stop him, but I won't go alone. Her hand pressed against Argo's chest. Then he goes too. Sarah said the pack protects both ways. Argo leaned into her palm, then looked to Daniel, steady as stone. Delaney hesitated. We can't take... Mason cut him off. We take the dog. A nose goes where eyes can't, and the sight of him might stop a fool from pulling a trigger. Doyle snorted. Best argument I've heard all night. Delaney relented. Fine. The dog goes. The agent keyed the mic again. Cutter Pelagia, this is Sierra. We have a compromised inspector at Sector 9 initiating transfer at Seabrook Haven. Request fast boat vector 82. Secure band Lima. A pause. Then blessedly. Pelagia copies. Underway at 12. Maintain silence. Relief rippled. The storm answered with lightning. Delaney turned crisp. Families in the basement. No heroics. Diego, bring rope, crowbars. Mason, you're on point. Hayes, you cover civilians. He looked at Ava, softer. And you're commander here until we return. Her eyes widened, then squared. Yes, sir. Argo pressed his flank to her leg, then to Daniel's. Mason checked his sidearm, then crossed to Ben. He touched 2 fingers to the fisherman's wrist, feeling the pulse Daniel had restored. His voice was rough. We end this for him. For Jonah. And for the child Whitaker marked, Daniel said. Mason's jaw worked. Especially for her. The wind clawed at the lighthouse. Time was up. Daniel kissed his daughter's brow. Back soon. Bring the light back, she whispered. Argo rose, scars silvering in the beacon's sweep. He pressed against both of them, then padded to the door. The storm blasted in as it opened, salt and rain whipping like claws. But they didn't shrink. They stepped into the night. The medic, the outlaw, the agents, and the shepherd who carried orders written into his bones. Some fights were won with rifles. This one would be won by loyalty that refused to bend, by a pack that chose to stand together. And Seabrook Haven held its breath, waiting for the reckoning the storm had only begun. Morning came to Seabrook Haven not with a triumphant sunrise, but with a bruised sky, its pale light revealing the scars left behind. Boats lay cracked against the rocks. Shingles and beams littered the waterfront like broken bones. The smell of salt, mud, and smoke hung in the air, a reminder that storms never truly leave, they only recede. Yet beneath that ruin, the town stirred with the stubborn heartbeat of survival. People emerged from battered homes and shops, moving slowly, shoulders bent, but alive. They had counted the names in their prayers through the night and found that most voices still answered at dawn. Most, but not all. At the lighthouse, a crowd gathered. Daniel stood with Ava by his side, her hand clutching his tightly. Argo sat at her feet, his coat still damp, scars more visible now in the softened light. They listened as Pastor Whitmore read Jonah Whitlock's name aloud, his voice trembling but steady enough to carry. The words were simple. A keeper of the light, a defender of his people. He gave his last strength so that others might live. A hush followed, broken only by the slap of waves against the pier. Old Doyle removed his cap, bowing his head. Sandra wept silently, a hand pressed to her lips. Even Mason Crow, standing at the edge of the group with his men, dipped his head in respect. Jonah had been a recluse, a man who lived with ghosts more than neighbors, but in the end, he had stood like a pillar when Seabrook Haven needed him most. Ava slipped her hearing aid off, the stickers peeled and worn from the storm. She turned it in her hands, as though offering it up. He said the light would always guide us, she whispered, not sure if anyone else caught the words. Daniel bent and kissed her crown, his throat too tight to answer. When the prayers ended, the practical work began. Nets were hauled from the mud, debris piled for burning, roofs patched with whatever timber survived. The town became a hive of motion, grief, and resilience braided into every hammer strike. Daniel joined them, shoulders aching from both labor and exhaustion. He was no stranger to stitching wounds, whether in flesh or wood. The principle was the same: mend, reinforce, make whole again. Still, he knew his skills were needed beyond carpentry. By midday, a line had formed outside the small clinic, neighbors bringing injuries that had been ignored during the storm's chaos. Twisted ankles, deep cuts, lungs tight from exposure. Daniel moved between them, hands practiced, voice calm. Ava helped by fetching bandages, holding lanterns steady, or simply sitting with frightened children, while Argo pressed close, his presence easing their fear more than any words could. It was in that moment, the room thick with gratitude, the line of weary faces slowly easing, that Leonard Pike appeared, shoulders slumped, hat in hand. He looked older than he had 2 days ago, his authority as harbour master stripped bare. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Hayes, we found this among the supplies." From the box he carried, Leonard lifted a tactical collar, sturdy black leather, reinforced stitching, reflective striping, and loops designed for handlers in the field. It was military issue, unmistakable. "Belonged to Sarah's unit," Leonard said quietly. "Thought it was only right your shepherd have it now." For a moment, the clinic stilled. Daniel reached out, fingers brushing the collar's cool surface. He glanced at Argo, who watched him with eyes that seemed to understand the weight of the gift. Slowly, he crouched and slipped it around the shepherd's neck. The fit was perfect. The town's murmurs rose, admiration, respect, a shared recognition that Argo was no longer just a dog to them. He was a defender, a soldier, and one of Seabrook Haven's own. Ava clapped her hands softly, her smile trembling but real. She pressed her face against Argo's neck, whispering something only he could hear. His tail thumped once against the floor, solemn and sure. Later that evening, when the fires burned to clear debris and smoke curled into the darkening sky, Daniel sat on the pier with Ava dozing against his shoulder. He watched the waters, still restless, and let the silence fill him. He thought of Jonah's last moments, the weight of the beam on his shoulders, the stubborn fire in his eyes. He thought of Mason's mud-caked hands pulling Ben Turner back from the edge, of townsfolk standing shoulder to shoulder when fear might have driven them apart. He thought too of Catherine, the wife he had lost, and how she would have smiled to see Ava's courage, how she would have wept to see the town stitched together again, not just by necessity, but by choice. Balance, Daniel realized, was what this place demanded. He could not simply be a fisherman, nor could he live only as a medic haunted by war. He would need to be both, a healer of bodies and a keeper of livelihoods. Seabrook Haven would ask for no less, and perhaps it would give him something back in return. A future where Ava could grow, where Argo could rest, where sacrifice would not always be the price of survival. As lanterns flickered to life along the battered docks, Daniel tightened his arm around his daughter and looked at the shepherd beside them. "We'll rebuild," he said quietly, more a vow than a statement. Argo leaned closer, pressing his scarred body against them, as if to say, "Not just rebuild, endure." And for the first time since the storm, Daniel believed it. By the week's end, the storm had become legend, a story already retold around kitchen tables, in the aisles of the rebuilt church, and at the diner where strong coffee kept tired eyes awake. But Seabrook Haven's wounds were not only of wood and stone. Justice, too, demanded mending. News traveled faster than tides when it carried the scent of reckoning. Inspector Whitaker, the man in polished shoes, the one who had smirked from the shadows of authority, was led away in handcuffs. DEA agents had intercepted him at a secondary port, the evidence undeniable. Smuggling ledgers, encrypted communications, offshore accounts, fat with cartel money. He did not fight when they placed the cuffs on his wrists. He only lowered his head, as though the storm itself had stripped him of any pretense. For the townsfolk, it was a vindication laced with sorrow. Trust once broken does not return easily. But there was relief in knowing the rot had a name, and that the man who had endangered a child to protect his empire would face judgment not from rumor or suspicion, but from the full weight of the law. At the lighthouse, Daniel listened as Agent Delaney briefed the community. His tone was firm, his words careful, but Daniel saw the lines around his eyes. The toll of secrets carried too long. "The cartel's coastal line is cut," Delaney said. "Seabrook Haven was meant to be a quiet transfer point. Instead, it became their undoing. That's because you stood your ground." Applause did not follow. Only silence, heavy and respectful, as neighbors considered what it had cost. Jonah Whitlock buried beneath the storm, homes swept into the sea, children who would not sleep easily for years to come. Later, Delaney took Daniel aside. "There's one more thing," he said, sliding an envelope across the table. Inside was a medical authorization stamped with federal priority. "Your daughter's case has been reviewed. She'll have surgery in Portland, the kind insurance refused to cover." Daniel's breath caught. His eyes moved from the papers to Ava, who sat with Argo in the corner, her small hand tracing the dog's collar like it was a talisman. She was humming softly, off-key, not knowing he could see the world's unfairness already bending at last in her favor. When he told her, she blinked in disbelief. "I'll hear again. Like before." "Better," Daniel whispered, pulling her close. "They'll fix what was broken. You'll hear the waves, the gulls, every word I say, without needing to look at my lips." His voice faltered. "You'll hear your mother's songs again, the ones we recorded, clear as the day she sang them." Ava pressed her face into his chest, trembling with joy she couldn't yet put into words. Argo, sensing the shift, pressed his nose into her shoulder, a low rumble in his chest like approval. Not all transformations, though, came from outside help. Some had to be forged from guilt, from choice, from the decision to walk a different road. That burden fell on Mason Crow. The man who once ruled the Black Tide Riders with threats now walked Seabrook Haven's streets without leather colors, without bravado. His men followed, though they looked more like workers than outlaws now, helping patch roofs, hauling nets, stacking sandbags for storms yet to come. It was Doyle who first called it aloud. "Can't keep calling you Black Tide if you're hauling lumber like the rest of us." Mason managed a rough chuckle. "Then call us something else." The name came from the town itself, not him. Seabrook Security. A promise instead of a threat. A wall against outsiders, not against their own. His men stitched new patches onto their jackets. Simple, white letters over a blue wave. Some townsfolk distrusted it, muttering in corners, remembering too well the first day Mason rode in like a wolf among sheep. But others saw the change with cautious hope. Daniel himself wrestled with it. He remembered Mason in the mud, hauling Ben Turner back from the brink. Remembered him steadying hands during surgery. Remembered a man stripped of arrogance when he whispered, "Don't let him die." It was Ava, in her quiet way, who settled the matter. One afternoon, as Mason passed by with a toolbox, Argo rose, not bristling, not wary, but calm. Ava stepped forward, looking up at the man who had once terrified her. "You helped save us," she said simply. "So you're part of the pack now." Mason froze, the words striking deeper than any sermon. He nodded once, voice too rough to answer, and continued on with the work. But Daniel saw the tremor in his jaw, the silent gratitude of a man given something rare, a chance to start again. By the month's end, Seabrook Haven looked different. Not healed, not whole, never entirely that, but stitched with resilience. Windows glowed again at dusk. Nets dried on the piers. Laughter, tentative but real, spilled from Maggie's diner. The lighthouse beam swept its steady arc, no longer a lonely watch, but a promise carried forward. Justice had come, not only through arrests and papers signed in distant offices, but through the choices made in battered streets and storm-lit nights. Healing had begun, not only in Ava's restored hearing, but in the hearts of a town that had discovered it could bend without breaking. And standing at the center of it all was a scarred shepherd with a new collar, his watchful eyes proof that Seabrook Haven would not be caught unguarded again. The tide was calm, the night the people of Seabrook Haven gathered for the candle boat ceremony. It was the first still evening since the storm, the air damp with salt and memory. Lanterns lined the pier, their glow soft against the scarred wood, while townsfolk moved quietly, carrying small wooden boats in their hands. Some carved new, others passed down for generations. Daniel stood among them, Ava at his side, Argo pressed close enough that her small shoulder brushed his fur. She held a boat no bigger than her palms, painted clumsily in bright blue and yellow. A single candle flickered in its center, flame bowing to the night breeze. The community had come together, not out of obligation, but instinct. For Jonah Whitlock, who had given his life beneath collapsing beams. For those who had lost their homes. For the harbor itself, wounded but alive. And perhaps for themselves, to remind one another that grief could be shared, that courage could be remembered. Pastor Mitchell spoke only a few words, his voice carrying over the water with the quiet authority of a man who had buried too many friends. We gather to honor not only those we lost to the storm, but those who chose to stand when standing seemed impossible. May these lights remind us that even in darkness, we do not walk alone. One by one, boats were set gently onto the tide. The water caught each flame and carried it outward, until the harbor was dotted with stars afloat. Children clutched their parents' hands. Old fishermen crossed their arms over sunken chests, eyes glistening in the firelight. Daniel knelt so Ava could lower her boat onto the waves. She hesitated, her lips pressed tight, then whispered, "For Mama, for Jonah." Her voice trembled, but the candle caught the tide, sailing steadily into the night. Argo leaned forward, ears pricked, watching the small boat drift as though it were part of his duty too. Ava bent and placed her lips near his scarred ear. Her words were soft, meant only for him. "We're home now," she said. The dog shifted, pressing his head gently against her chest, and for a moment it seemed he understood every syllable. That her declaration wasn't about a house or a dock, but about safety found, about love reclaimed after too much loss. Daniel's throat tightened. He had heard his daughter speak many brave things since the storm, commands given with a soldier's clarity, questions shaped by innocence, sharpened too soon. But this quiet assurance to a battered shepherd, struck deeper than all. It was hope, distilled, small, yet unbreakable. The lighthouse beam swept across the water, cutting a pale path over the drifting candles. Its rhythm was steady, unhurried, like a heartbeat that would not fail them. Where once it had felt like a lonely sentinel, now it seemed to belong to them all, a reminder that even in solitude, there was a light to return to. Mason Crow stood at the back of the crowd, his men scattered among the townsfolk. No one asked him to speak. None needed to. His head bowed as Jonah's name was read, and when he raised it again, Daniel caught the glint of something that looked very much like sorrow, perhaps even reverence. Old Doyle, leaning heavily on his cane, muttered loud enough for those near to hear. "Men like Jonah don't die. They keep watch from the other side. That's why the sea never takes everything." The words, simple and rough, settled over the crowd like a benediction. As the last boats drifted beyond the breakwater, Ava tugged Daniel's sleeve. "Do you think Mama sees this?" Daniel knelt again, taking her small hands into his weathered ones. "I think she sees more than we can imagine, and I think she's proud of you, of us, of the way we stood." He glanced at Argo, lying at their feet, eyes tracking every flicker of light. "And proud of him too." Ava nodded solemnly, her gaze fixed on the shepherd. "He never stopped guarding us. Not even once." Daniel looked down at the dog, at the way storm scars seemed to sit easily on him, as if they were simply proof of the battles survived. Quiet heroism was not sung about, not carved into stone, but carried in the posture of a German shepherd who had stood between a child and the world's darkness and never flinched. The beam of the lighthouse turned again, sweeping the horizon steady and sure. And in its light, Seabrook Haven's people stood together, scarred but unbroken, humbled but proud, bound by the resilience of a town, the loyalty of a dog, and the fragile, enduring courage of a little girl who whispered to the waves, "We're home." At the heart of this story, what lingers is not just the storm or the danger, it's the love between a little girl and her dog. German shepherds like Argo remind us of the quiet, steadfast loyalty that animals bring into our lives. They guard us when we don't even know we need guarding, and they teach us that family can be built not only by blood, but by trust, devotion, and the steady beat of a faithful companion's heart. If you've ever looked into your dog's eyes and felt they understood more than words could say, you already know that bond. For those who want to deepen that connection, I've come across a resource that might help. It's not about training tricks or commands, but about understanding the way your dog loves and communicates. I'll leave the link here for you to explore if it feels right. Take it as a suggestion from a friend who values the same things you do: love, loyalty, and the gift of never being truly alone when a dog is at your side.